Okay, so we've got one job to do. We've got to make something this big into something this big. Yeah, we're amplifying something, and that's what we're going to be talking about this afternoon. Now, without sounding like the vintage amplifier guy, and I know I talk about amplifiers a lot, and I also talk about the need to make the amplifier the heart of your vintage home hi-fi system. There's a couple of bits and pieces that we need to talk about with regard to amplification and how over time amplification has improved and then stalled for a little while, and some would argue went backwards, and then over time has improved pretty much to the present day. And of course, over time there's been different classes, or classes as I would say, of amplifier, class A, B, C, D and onwards. Now, I'm a big fan of Class A amplification because effectively what Class A amplification means is that you get a consistent power output with a minimum amount of noise, hiss, buzz and distortion and feedback, and you get a huge bang for your buck. So in other words, you get a high volume output, particularly when driving difficult speakers such as the JBLs, which I've mentioned before. And Class A amplification effectively should give you the same quality output at 10% of output level to if you're driving difficult speakers at 100% of output level. So effectively, you're not going to be driving noise or distortion as you turn the volume knob up. And one of the major drawbacks of Class A amplification, of course, is that they required big transformers. They required big heat sinks, big capacitors, and a big pocket to drive them. In other words, they were quite expensive to buy, but they also consumed an awful lot of power. Now, the amplifier that I'm going to show you this afternoon, at full volume, so at 40 watts per channel, actually requires 500 watts of power at 230 volts, which is a huge amount of power. And certainly at the time that the amplifier I'm going to show you this afternoon was launched, so 1980, 500 watts were 5 big light bulbs that were running in the home. And so for the first time, home electronic equipment were consuming far more than a light bulb, was consuming around half of that a standard room heater would consume. And people were looking at their electricity bills thinking, not only can I not afford the amplifier in the first place, but I certainly can't afford to run it. Now, of course, if you listen at normal volume levels, and those of you that know most of the UK's housing stock is that we haven't got big detached houses in the middle of the country, so we were unable to drive these things at full volume anyway. But with power consumption at around about 500 watts, these amplifiers not only drank your energy, but also emitted more heat through their heat sinks than you may care to mention. And certainly putting a video recorder, for argument's sake, on top of here, or even a cassette deck would ultimately lead to tape damage or even warping of the cases in certain settings. So you had to keep these amplifiers outside of those wooden cabinets that so much hi-fi equipment was placed into during that time. So this particular amp is the Technics SU-V2. It's a glimpse of it here. And the SU-V2 not only was classified as new Class A, okay, so there were actually very little differences between Class A and new Class A other than the linearity of the sound output. In other words, that measure of distortion was the same at 10% or 100% output, i.e. no distortion when driving at full tilt. It also had something called synchro bias, which basically meant that both channels were operating at the same output levels at all time. So if you had exactly the same feed coming in, then that's what would be replicated at a higher volume on the way out. But it was also a DC amplifier as well, so a direct current amplifier, reducing some of that alternation in the voltage, so it should give you a smoother sound output with even less distortion and less characteristics of that alternating current supply. Now, Personally, I'm not close enough to the technical nature of DC versus AC amplifiers. And some of the engineers that I've spoken to at the time suggest that DC amplifiers actually gave you a punchier output and gave you a greater ability to drive 4-ohm speakers than a standard AC amplifier. But, you know, as somebody who sold this equipment and someone that listens to this equipment today, I'm not sure if I can hand on heart tell you that a DC amplifier would give you any noticeable difference compared to their AC counterparts. And given the fact that this amplifier cost around about £250 at retail price in 1980, I'm not sure the people who were buying this would have actually known the difference anyway. Now, one of the things with the SU-V2 is that it had a number of European controls added into the patent design that was previously marketed in the US, Canada, and Japan. And that was a couple of filters that were inbuilt. They were called high filters and subsonic filters, which you'll have a look at in a moment. But also they had switchable loudness controls. So the loudness control often put off audiophiles from buying Japanese hi-fi separates because they said that loudness in the increased bass response damages the purity of the sound. But also it had defeat controls on the tone settings. So you'll note on here, if you look closely enough, that the bass and treble controls on here have got the usual ±5%, or the ±5 settings, but also they have a center position which was defeat, and that effectively takes that potentiometer out of the circuit when playing any sort of source. So that again was designed to talk to audiophiles, particularly in the UK and Europe, who didn't want any clutter in their amplification. Now, of course, talking about clutter, you'll see that this has a fluorescent display, and fluorescent displays were actually charged with quite a few issues around about the 80s, because fluorescence, unlike LCD displays and LED displays, is actually they created hum by themselves. And of course we've all heard that when you switch a fluorescent tube on in the kitchen or in the bathroom or whatever, you can hear that background hum that fluorescent tubes create. Well, that's the same within microfluorescent displays such as these that are seen on the amplifier. And unfortunately, the SU-V2 didn't have a defeat control of that fluorescent display. So it was on all the time, even though it had different attenuation settings on there. So despite the fact that the SU-V2 had significant support within the hi-fi journals at the time, such as What Hi-Fi, it won a Hi-Fi award in 1981, which it maintained then for a further 3 years. It didn't ever reach the audiophile market, but nevertheless sold over 120,000 pieces throughout Europe, and at £250 retail price, many retailers and in fact Matsushita Corporation were very happy with its design. And as I've mentioned before, that once you've got a winning amplifier design, particularly a Class A amplifier, what is there to change? You know, apart from the ability to switch the fluorescent display on and off, you might as well keep the design as is. And from what we've discovered, certainly in the 10 years that immediately followed the launch of this amplifier, there were only 2 changes to the original design. One was replacing the DIN input on the back, because of course the 5-pin audio DIN became redundant in most of Europe as RCAs became more popular, but also it changed the phono stage in here as well to make the phono stage compatible with all moving magnet cartridges from the time. So the amplifier itself was relatively unchanged for a long period of time. And as I say, I've been after this type of amplifier for some time, and I've done a number of side-by-side comparison tests with the Marantz PM350, the JVC AX2, which you've seen before, but also this one here. And this amplifier definitely drives tricky speakers better than any other amplifier I've tried of late. And outside of some of the earlier Denon receivers and amplifiers, I believe that this is one of the better amplifiers that you can still get hold of. Now in 2017, all the capacitors were replaced in this unit, along with a diode and a couple of other resistors as well, well over my head. But this amp, I think, will give anybody another 10 years of use, and certainly when I've driven it through the speakers, fed by a good quality analog source, you can't pick up any hum or distortion. The phono input on here is pure class. It is absolutely amazing. So I plug my turntable into here, absolutely no hum, no distortion, and no background noise at all, which says to me that the components in here are running efficiently. It does get warm. I would never recommend putting this amplifier into a case or other sort of cabinet. It does need to have free-flowing air, but it is an incredible piece of kit. So just having a closer look. So just to walk through some of the controls on here. So you've got two pairs of speakers, so you can drive two pairs of 4 ohm or two pairs of 8 ohm loudspeakers. You've got these beautiful toggle switches which have got a definite feeling of something from the 70s. So rather than push buttons that you found on a lot of equipment at the time, the main switches were on these lovely toggle switches, which, you know, many sort of sci-fi films and even the Towering Inferno used lots of these toggle switches because they sounded great, but also the mechanics behind them were incredibly long lasting. And you may be able to see on here that some of the paint over these switches has worn off, so you can see how often this amplifier has been switched on and off, but it's still, that rocker switch is absolutely superb. You've got bass and treble with the defeat controls. You've got the subsonic and high-end filter there, which cuts out all that that noise which is often picked up from turntables, especially where you've got your speakers too close to a turntable. Balance controls and loudness button, and of course up here you've got switches for input and output selector, which would have allowed dubbing between two cassette decks, maybe a VHS player or other analog source. You've of course got the volume control and something which was rather lovely at the time, which was a little illuminated Class A little brand down here. And when plugged in and switched on, that glows a lovely warm white colour. It's a really nice touch, and it really sets this amplifier apart. As I say, you've also got the fluorescent display, and the fluorescent display is what's known as a peak hold meter. So it will actually show you the maximum output that has been recorded on the output stage of the amplifier in the previous few seconds, and it will hold it there on the display so you can actually see what high level outputs you've been achieving. Now, many of you will know I don't actually believe that these output meters were very accurate at the time, but nevertheless I've been driving the old JBLs on here, and the performance is well over 40 watts per channel and closer to 60 watts per channel, consuming between 400 and 450 watts of power to achieve that. So on the rear, you will note that you've got your usual RCA inputs on here, but you've also got the 5-pin DIN as well. And the 5-pin DIN, as most of you know, was pretty much withdrawn from use in Europe in 1983. So this dates this amplifier as one of the first releases of the SU-V2. Two sets of speakers here, and you've got a multi-voltage setting as well, so you can set it for anywhere within the European Union at that time, which was 220, 230, 240, or even 250 volts. And there you go, there's the rating plate on here, which suggests that this does consume up to 500 watts, half a kilowatt, when driven at maximum volume. So the SU-V2, it is a great amplifier, and if I hadn't bought myself a Marantz amplifier in the last couple of weeks, I wouldn't be selling this. But I've just got no need for it now. And the reason for buying it was to check whether or not there was something wrong with these JBL speakers, which I've had for a while, which are incredibly difficult to drive. So the JVC AX2 performed well. The valve amp that I've got performed poorly, frankly. It just couldn't drive the speakers at all, limp and lifeless. This thing has produced some of the best quality audio I have ever heard through those loudspeakers, and believe me, I've been trying to get a decent source for them for what, 7 years now. So this definitely gets a 4.5 if not 5-star rating from me. Now of course my heart very much sits with the Marantz amp. It's not a DC amplifier, it's not a flash bit of kit, but it is a damn good sounding amp. It works with moving coil as well as moving magnet cartridges, so it has that advantage for me as well. So for now, the Marantz, I'm afraid, sits at the heart of my vintage hi-fi system. The Technics SU-V2 will unfortunately be for sale very soon on my Facebook page. So that was a quick journey through Technics amplification versus some of the others that were around at the time. Now, I know that a lot of audiophiles will criticize everything I say about Japanese amplification. So, you know, at the time, very famous amps such as the NAB 3020 were designed to cut down on the amount of bits and pieces that got in the way of producing sound quality by reducing flashing lights and by taking out all unnecessary controls. And as I've said before, the Japanese didn't want to do that. They still wanted to appeal to mass market buyers who wanted that additional flexibility, whether or not that was JVC with their graphic equalizers or Technics that were designing new classes of amplifier pretty much on the fly. And of course there were nothing like the British producers and some German producers as well that were literally taking out potentiometers and just leaving a volume control and an input control and taking out all tonal adjustment. Now of course we look back now and we think, how could anyone take away that user flexibility? Because we all know that one record pressing may sound different to another, and one input source will almost certainly sound different to another, and therefore we do need to vary at least the bass and treble controls. But of course one of the solutions around the 80s and 90s was to add an SEA graphic equalizer as a separate component into your hi-fi system, and that would give you that flexibility, leaving then the purist audiophile market to listen to their purest analog source. Now, I'm not going to get into an argument about that, and I think there's definitely room in the market for two players. But as somebody that's listened to an awful lot of amplification in my years, from pretty good super A quality Japanese amplifiers to UK and German equipment, and then unfortunately onto some of the MIDI and micro systems that were produced in the 90s, I believe that Japanese amplification from the 1980s was some of the best, and is still some of the best amplification available anywhere. And certainly when you compare it to a lot of the super Class A amps in use today, driven by microcircuits rather than transistors and capacitors and the like, these sound probably 10 or 15 times better. Albeit, of course, you couldn't run them from a USB or a rechargeable battery source, and that's one of the benefits that Super Class A and using integrated circuits had on amps at that time. So if you're interested in the SU-V2, as I say, it's available on the Facebook page. Take a closer look at the photos, and I hope it will give whoever buys it many, many, many years of outstanding use. I love it, but I've got to say goodbye. So, speak to you soon. Thanks for watching.